Margaret, a poor widow who knew the taste of hardship more than anyone else. When her husband died, she was left with nothing but a tiny mud house, a piece of farmland, and her little boy, James. Life became a daily battle. She would rise before the first crow of the rooster, walking barefoot to the farm with a basket on her head. The sun burned her skin, the rain drenched her clothes, yet she never stopped. Her hands, once soft, became rough and blistered from cutting firewood to sell in the market. On some days, she would carry heavy loads on her back for wealthy neighbors just to earn a few coins to buy food. At night, when James was asleep, Margaret often cried silently. Not because of her own hunger, but because she had given him the last portion of food. Many times, she would tie a cloth tightly around her stomach to suppress the pangs of hunger so her son would never know she had gone to bed starving. Her clothes were always torn, patched over and over again with pieces of fabric. When James asked her why she never bought new ones, she would smile and say, "My child, as long as you are in school, that is my new cloth." The villagers laughed at her, calling her the woman of rags. But Margaret never answered them. Her eyes were fixed on one thing, her son's future. She believed that if James could become educated, all her tears and pain would be worth it. To pay for his school, Margaret sold almost everything she had. The little jewelry her husband gave her on their wedding day, the farm tools she inherited, and even the goats she once hoped to raise, all gone, sacrificed for James. Despite all the humiliation, hunger, and pain, Margaret never gave up. She carried her suffering like a crown of honor, because deep down, she believed that one day her son would rise and change their story forever. With every sacrifice Margaret made, James grew stronger. He was bright, determined, and carried within him the silent prayers of his mother. When other children stayed home for lack of fees, Margaret made sure James never missed a day. She would walk barefoot for miles just to beg for work on strangers' farms so she could pay his school bills. Her sacrifices bore fruit. James excelled in his studies, winning the admiration of his teachers. His name became the pride of the village, and soon, he earned a scholarship that took him abroad. The day he left, Margaret's heart was filled with both joy and pain. Joy that her son's future was finally secure, and pain that she had to let him go with nothing but her prayers. Years passed. James returned, not the skinny boy who once wore patched clothes, but a tall, polished man dressed in expensive suits. He drove into the village in a convoy of cars, the air filled with songs of celebration. The villagers who once mocked Margaret now hailed her as the mother of greatness. They bowed before James, praising his success. He was now a wealthy businessman, owner of companies and properties. Newspapers carried his name, and influential people sought his presence. Margaret was proud. Her sacrifices had not been in vain. She thought her suffering days were finally over. But wealth, though a blessing, brought with it a slow, silent poison. James's new world was far removed from the mud house that raised him. His wife, Sophia, came from a rich family and looked down on Margaret from the very first day. She often complained that Margaret's presence in their mansion was a shameful reminder of poverty. At first, James resisted. He would tell Sophia, "That is my mother. Without her, I wouldn't be who I am." But Sophia's whispers never ceased. "She embarrasses us in front of guests," she would say. "Look at her clothes. Look at the way she eats. What will people think?" Gradually, those whispers began to sink into James's heart. The same man who once kissed his mother's hands in gratitude now began to see her as a burden. He started keeping her away from his social gatherings, asking her not to sit with his friends, and avoiding being seen with her in public. Margaret noticed the change. The warm embraces became fewer, the kind words less frequent. She tried to console herself, saying, "Maybe he is just busy with work." But deep down, she feared that the son she had raised with tears was slowly slipping away from her grasp, consumed by the glitter of wealth and the influence of a woman who never knew the depth of their suffering. It was a bright morning when Sophia finally pushed James beyond the point of return. She had been pressuring him for months, telling him that keeping Margaret in their mansion was ruining their reputation. That morning, after an embarrassing incident where one of James's wealthy associates had mocked Margaret's simple dressing, Sophia struck her final blow. "James," she hissed, "you have to choose, your status or your mother. Because as long as she stays here, people will never respect you." Her words dug deep, feeding the pride that had already been growing inside him. Blinded by arrogance and shame, James made a decision that would stain his soul forever. Later that day, Margaret was in the kitchen, peeling yam with her frail hands, humming softly to herself. She had no idea what awaited her. Suddenly, Sophia stormed in with a sharp voice. "Pack your things. You are leaving this house today." Margaret looked up in shock, her knife falling from her hand. "Leaving?" she whispered. "But this is my son's home." James walked in, avoiding her gaze. In his hands was a small bag, the same bag Margaret had used years ago to send him to school, patched and old. He placed it before her, filled with only a few of her clothes. His voice was cold, almost unrecognizable. "Mother, it's time you returned to the village. You can't stay here anymore." The words pierced her like a dagger. She stared at her son, the very one she had starved for, wept for, worked for. Her lips trembled. "James, my son, are you the one saying this to me?" But James didn't answer. His eyes were heavy with guilt, yet his pride wouldn't let him turn back. Behind him, Sophia smirked, satisfied with her victory. Margaret's heart broke into pieces. With tears streaming down her wrinkled face, she lifted the bag onto her head, the same way she once carried baskets of firewood to feed him. Slowly, she walked out of the mansion. Outside, the security guards looked on silently, their faces filled with pity. Neighbors gathered, whispering in disbelief as they watched the once proud mother of the great businessman being cast out like a beggar. Margaret's feet dragged along the ground, heavy with sorrow. Each step away from the mansion was a reminder that the son she had given her life for had traded her love for pride and the poisonous words of his wife. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly abandoned, not by the world, not by strangers, but by the very child who was once her only reason to live. Not long after Margaret left the mansion, life began to teach James the lesson he never thought he would learn. At first, everything seemed normal. His businesses were booming, his friends surrounded him, and Sophia walked proudly at his side, dressed in the latest fashions. James believed he was untouchable. But pride, as the old saying goes, always comes before a fall. It started like a whisper. Contracts that were once guaranteed suddenly failed. A major business deal collapsed after a foreign investor pulled out. Within weeks, more cracks appeared. His warehouses caught fire under mysterious circumstances, wiping out millions. His once loyal business partners turned cold, each one withdrawing their investments to protect themselves. James tried to fight back, but the harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. Soon, creditors began knocking at his doors, demanding repayment. Banks froze his accounts. The mansion that once echoed with laughter became filled with arguments and silence. Sophia, who had once pretended to love him, revealed her true colors. She no longer smiled, no longer held his hand in public. Instead, she mocked him behind closed doors. "You're useless now," she spat one evening. "What kind of man loses everything so quickly? Maybe I married the wrong man." Her words cut deeper than any wound. But James endured, hoping things would turn around. Unfortunately, they only grew worse. Within months, he was forced to sell his cars, then his properties. The mansion itself was seized by the bank. And then came the ultimate betrayal. One morning, James woke up to find Sophia gone. She had packed her clothes, her jewelry, and even the little money he had left. By her side was another man, a wealthy associate James had once introduced her to at a party. She didn't leave quietly. She left with scorn, telling him, "I can't waste my life with a failure." Broken, abandoned, and penniless, James found himself alone in a rented apartment he could barely afford. The same friends who once sang his praises no longer answered his calls. The same society that bowed to him now turned its back. He had everything, but because of pride and arrogance, he lost it all. And worse still, he had no mother by his side, because he had cast her out when he thought he no longer needed her. As the weight of his downfall pressed heavily upon him, James fell sick. His body grew weak, his once strong frame reduced to skin and bones. There was no one left to care for him. No wife, no friends, no riches. Just silence, regret, and the memory of the mother he had betrayed. James's health grew worse with each passing day. What began as weakness soon turned into fever, and the fever turned into days of unconsciousness. He had no one left to call. His phone was filled with numbers of wealthy friends who now refused to answer him. His wife had abandoned him. The world had forgotten him. One evening, he collapsed by the roadside, his frail body too weak to carry itself. Passers-by stared but walked past. Only one stranger, a kind driver, stopped and carried him into his car. James could barely whisper, "Take me to the village," before slipping into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on a bamboo bed inside a small mud house. The air smelled of firewood smoke, and a familiar voice hummed softly nearby. He tried to turn his head, and his eyes fell on her. There she was, Margaret, his mother. Her back was bent with age and suffering, her hands still rough from years of hard labor. But those same hands, hands he once despised, were now gently wiping sweat from his forehead. She had been sitting by his side for hours, caring for him like she did when he was a child. Tears filled James's eyes. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Mother." Margaret turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. They were not eyes of anger or hatred, but of deep sorrow mixed with love. She said nothing, only sighed heavily and continued to cool his body with a damp cloth. James broke down. His heart shattered into pieces as he realized the depth of her love. This was the same woman he had humiliated, the one he had thrown out of his mansion with nothing but an old bag. Yet here she was, nursing him back to life when the entire world had abandoned him. For days, Margaret fed him, bathed him, and prayed for him. She gave him the little food she had, even if it meant starving herself again. Slowly, James regained strength. But with every breath he took, guilt tore deeper into his soul. One morning, as the sun filtered through the cracks of the mud house, James knelt before his mother. With tears streaming down his face, he cried, "Mother, forgive me. I chose wealth over you. I allowed pride to blind me. And still, you never gave up on me." Margaret, with tears in her own eyes, placed her hand on his head and whispered, "My son, I carried you in my womb, and nothing can erase the love of a mother. I forgave you the moment you left, because no matter how far you go, you will always be my child." James wept bitterly, holding her feet as the weight of regret crushed him. He finally understood that true wealth was not in riches, not in friends, not in status, but in the unconditional love of the woman who had never stopped loving him, even when he gave her every reason to stop. James broke down in tears, realizing the greatest treasure he ever had was not money, nor his friends, but his mother. The story ends with a lesson. Never forget the hand that fed you when you were hungry, because the world has a way of humbling the proud and rewarding true love.